Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn webinar. Before I introduce today's presenters, I'll first cover some basic details on the layout of the webinar. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the presentation, but we certainly encourage your participation and comments. We'll have time for questions at the conclusion of the presentation. We just ask that you utilize the chat function of the Zoom webinar. You can feel free to direct message me. My name is Will Schneider, and I can facilitate the Q&A with the panelists at the conclusion. We just ask that you keep your questions kind of tuned towards the topic of the presentation, and we will do our best to get through as many as possible. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing the Land Institute's Civic Science programming. First, we'll hear from the Land Institute's Director of Ecosphere Studies, Dr. Aubrey Streit Krug, who will be presenting on the current civic science projects we are engaged in. Aubrey will then be joined by a panel of TLI scientists for Q&A after the presentation. Joining her will be Dr. Ebony Murrell, who leads our Crop Protection Ecology program, Dr. Catherine Turner, who leads the Crop Protection Genetics Lab, Dr. David Van Tassel, lead scientist for our Perennial Oilseeds program, and Dr. Brandon Schlottman, who leads our Perennial Legumes program. And all of them work very closely with Aubrey on the active civic science projects. And without further ado, we will turn it over to Aubrey.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you. Great. So can we just confirm you can see? Okay, great. So thank you again for your interest in civic science, and I will do my best in the next half hour or so to explain a little bit about what civic science means, why we do it, how we're doing it, and where this work might lead over the coming growing seasons and years. So in this opening slide, which you'll see again at the end, I just wanted to give you an example of what one of our civic science research plots looks like. These photos were taken by one of our collaborators in Pennsylvania, homemade signage, and in their words, describing the project and some of the reasons why they were excited to participate in perennial agriculture and the benefits it has ecologically. So in ecosphere studies and in the Land Institute's work in the human dimensions of agriculture, we often come to this question as a starting place. And this particular question has driven and inspired my work. If the ecological future of agriculture is to be diverse and perennial, what is required of us in social terms? So what can people do? What is the role of people? How do people need to learn or grow or change? How does science interface with society in this work? So this question, over the last several years, since I joined the Land Institute, about the role of people in our work to create a diverse and perennial agriculture, has led to some of what I'm going to share with you, the story of how we started becoming involved in civic science work. So when I first posed this question and started to investigate it, I started to think about what existing methodologies and approaches there are to engaging people in agricultural research. So this slide shows an overview of some of those emerging methods and approaches over the last century. This slide is from an article by Corey Knapp and her collaborators that came out last year that is about placing transdisciplinarity in context. And transdisciplinarity just means working across different disciplines in the arts and humanities and social and natural sciences, and also beyond them into communities to engage publics. So you can see there are lots of different approaches ranging from participatory action to transdisciplinary to up at the top, there's citizen science and adaptive management. So there's a wide body of research and methodologies available, all of which are really interesting and exciting. So we had Corey Knapp, the fabulous Corey Knapp, come and do a seminar with us at the Land Institute back in November 2018. And she and her colleagues at that time helped us start to understand the differences and value of some of these approaches, and to brainstorm about some of the projects that we might do to involve communities in the work of perennial agriculture. Also, over the last several years, I've been lucky to be in collaboration and conversation with many other community practitioners and artists. And I wanted to give credit to one in particular, who's pictured here at the left, Carmen Cristina Moreno, who's an independent artist in Kansas City, Missouri, and who I've been involved with through Ecosphere Studies workshops and different art collaborative events. And Carmen really introduced me to thinking about the framework of civic science in contrast to citizen science. So she brings a very strong justice perspective to her work based on her lived experiences and commitments that I have found really inspiring. And she suggested to me that traditional citizen science approaches that have sort of one-time data collection from people who really aren't in relationship with each other, that just benefit the project, the person who's doing the organizing, and don't sort of move back in the other direction. There's room to grow those into more civic approaches and to ongoing communities of relationship and mutual benefit. And Carmen herself has developed different programming around a civic science community in Kansas City, Missouri for people of color. So Carmen's work has inspired me to think about the shift in potential from citizen to civic science and why that might be important in terms of ongoing relationships of mutual benefit. At the same time, in our broader cultural sphere, there's been increasing interest in civic science. This article about the civic science imperative is a nice summary of that. And the imperative part is about how this type of approach or methodology can generate more legitimate and durable knowledge and results. So it can generate legitimacy in both social and scientific terms. The civic science approach in generally can be about kind of culture of relationship between science and society. It can also mean, in very sort of practical terms, civic science is about designing and facilitating distributed communities to collaborate on growing and learning and evaluating and collecting meaningful data that's both scientific and social. So in our case, we're thinking about those communities in terms of perennial plants. As the quotation here at the bottom from the Civic Science Imperative article suggests, civic science is about creating these ongoing feedback loops that increase knowledge, that move over time, and they look different based on different projects, but what they share is a kind of process based on mutual benefit and learning. So this frame of community learning over time is important and can be used to help solve problems that we don't know how to solve, that are really tricky or wicked, and can help us learn what we don't know. Agriculture is definitely a tricky, wicked global problem that many people are working to improve in many ways. This grand global challenge of agriculture has come into conversation with new methods. So there is existing literature and emerging suggestions about how citizen science approaches relate to extension, relate to participatory research and grower networks, and can involve people to meet these different challenges in agriculture that from the article listed below include monitoring pests and pathogens, preserving biodiversity and ecosystem services, enhancing food safety, nutrition, and flavor, improving food and food security, and advancing social justice and education and learning. So all of these needs to improve agriculture ecologically and socially are what motivate the work of the Land Institute. And we also have a framework for understanding how perenniality and diversity, and in particular the creation of new perennial grain crops and the ability to grow them in diverse agroecosystems, we think are key to solving these problems. So this methodology could be helpful in perennial agriculture, in the development of new grain crops, and in making agriculture perennial. So bringing people and plants together effectively to move across this gradient into a more diverse ecosystem that has the type of services and processes and functions that we need, and that also feeds people over time. So our goals with thinking about civic science approaches in perennial agriculture were about broadening and diversifying participation, creating active stakeholders and participants, and we hypothesized that we might be able to, over time, speed up some of the domestication of perennial crops and our understanding of their agroecology. So move forward the scientific work at the same time that we moved forward and built the social capacity for the adoption and use of those future food crops. So we're thinking about how to answer this question by using a civic science method to increase participation in and support of these new crops and caring for them over time. So another way to think about this is a framework we've started pondering about how domestication processes move forward and the role of people in different components of domesticating a crop, moving it from a wild plant to a successful, widespread, widely used and eaten food crop. So we've started to think about how there are genetic changes and agronomic knowledge, as well as cultural drivers that are based upon awareness and use of that plant. So civic science methodologies might be able to help us meet multiple of these needs or to drive change in multiple areas by gaining scientific knowledge that relates to genetic change in plants and their domestication, but also by learning more about how to care for them and about building relationships and a community of people who care for them and care about them and know how to use them and want to use them. With perennial projects and civic science work with perennial plants, it's important to realize that just as domestication is an ongoing iterative process that takes time, so too does growing and caring for perennial plants over multiple seasons take time, and it requires participants in a civic science project to participate perennially over multiple years. So unlike some other citizen science methodologies where you can ask people to one time go out and collect a piece of data and submit it online anonymously, in our case, we need ongoing attention to plants over several years. So we need people who can sustain their motivation and learn over time. So we've started to develop a conceptual model for how to study how this process of participation in a perennial civic science project might not only change plants, but also change people. How does their motivation continue? Does it grow? Does it decrease? What causes that? When do they drop out of a project? What causes them to be part of it over time and stick with it? And also, what do they learn over time? What are the outcomes? And there are lots of methods in the literature for how to evaluate this. So this is a broad understanding of what civic science is and how it relates to our work at the Land Institute. And I wanted to also, before I talk about some of the specific projects, just give a brief overview of some of the other people I work with at the Land Institute across multiple research programs. These are some of the lead scientists and staff and technicians who participate and facilitate in these civic science projects that I'm going to tell you about. So the first civic science project that we launched was with Silphium integrifolium. And maybe I'll go back and you can see this is Silphium integrifolium, rosin weed. It's a native North American perennial prairie plant that we're domesticating for oilseeds production and to become an oilseeds crop. And Silphium in particular has different challenges agroecologically in terms of pests and pathogens that made it appealing to think about growing in multiple locations to understand how it would respond to those multiple environments. This is a crop that has not been grown as a crop before, so it hasn't been grown in many of these places, and we didn't know how it would respond and what ecologically we would see in those places. So that motivated us to work in particular on Silphium first. And we launched the Silphium project about a year ago in summer 2019. We found that people were motivated initially to join us. We got a very high response rate, which was exciting. And we have about 45 people in 18 states across the country participating in this project. You can see a little bit more information about their identities and who they are. And when we ask what initially motivated them or what drew them to this work, people said that they were most excited about making practical contributions to transformative positive change in agriculture. So people were really excited about the opportunity to do something, to be involved in a direct and practical and experiential way, and to be part of this larger and longer story. So in the project, people do a lot of care for their plants. These are some more project participant photos, including one of my son, who is part of the project in a more peripheral way and supporting way. People received seedlings, they planted them, they must weed and water and care for them, they observe them, and they complete monthly surveys back to us. And meanwhile, we send updates about what we're learning every month and provide educational materials and support for them. So an example of that educational material is, this is from a recent survey we sent out, where we provided a growth stage chart and asked people to tell us where their strongest plant was on this chart, so that over the country we can understand the phenology of the responses of Silphium. So people are submitting this type of scientific data to us about their observations, how their plants are doing. In our case, we're really interested to see, especially this summer when their Silphium blooms for the first time, what sort of insects and other creatures we might start to interact with. The surveys also collect social data. These are results from our last month survey, where we asked people who were returning. This is the beginning of year 2 of the project in April 2020, and we asked people about what motivated them to return, what drew them back. And you can see that the biggest response for people was actually seeing their Silphium return. So the direct practical experience of being involved and having some sort of a relationship with this plant in their backyard or farm or garden or neighbor community garden was very motivating for people. And then other top responses were about their own inner motivation and their commitment to this work and this project and the vision of it. We are currently recruiting to build another small pilot cohort of growers who would grow Silphium ecotype isolation plots. So we are being able to bring on a few more people who can help us create these reservoirs around the country that will be useful for us in research and restoration. But currently we are welcoming more people, but we hope that we will be able to grow this project even more. Our pilot community and the ecotype isolation plots we think of as more experimental projects where we're learning how to do civic science, and people are very generously learning along with us. But to really generate the results that we need to contribute to scientific advancement and to understand and catalyze social change, we need to involve more people. And this aligns nicely with the needs demonstrated in the civic and citizen science literature, where there have not been very many studies of experimental work where people are in different groups and they're actually looking at results by different treatments of experiences. And also there have not been very many long-term studies. So we think with perennial agriculture, we have a real ability to contribute to longer-term analysis and understanding, where we can actually innovate some of the methods and approach at the same time that we're advancing our work and our mission. In addition to greatly scaling the size of participants, we need to broaden the participants so that they represent the variety of different cultural backgrounds and knowledge that might shape their relationship to Silphium. As I mentioned, Silphium is a native North American plant. There are ethnobotanical records of indigenous relationships with it, including ones that are definitely ongoing. And so we need to pay attention to that, learn from that, and be in relationship with people who have relationships with Silphium. And then finally, we think that we can learn more about how people learn through this larger cohort. To support that, we also are interested in how all people learn, not only participants, but also ourselves as researchers. So this is just a typology of the many types of questions that we can address and explore through a civic science project, ranging from individual outcomes to program level outcomes to larger community outcomes, and involving participants and researchers and community members. And finally, to scale this work, we need stronger and more robust and accessible digital infrastructure. So we need to be able to more easily collect and manage and share and visualize data as we grow this work. So there are existing platforms and opportunities. I've highlighted a few of them here. You might be familiar with citsci.org, which is a platform for developing citizen science projects. Many people use iNaturalist, and you can see a map there of some of the Silphium and tegrafolium spottings across the US and markers. And then there are also beginning to be a lot of exploration of how, through extension and grower networks, how different smartphone apps and digital platforms can better facilitate that type of community work. So that's another area for us to grow into. So I'll turn now briefly to another civic science project that we just launched this spring recently, and that is for our Perennial legumes program. So we recruited a small cohort of 20 participants to grow Sandpoint, or Onobrychus viciifolia, which is a nitrogen fixing legume that grows well in semi-arid areas. It has a history of use as a forage crop, but we are interested in developing it as and breeding it to be a pulse or grain legume for human consumption. So we wanted to start to cultivate a network of participants and identify areas and environments where Sandpoint would grow well and be suitable potentially for grain production. And we're also interested in the phenology of Sandpoint and how it responds in these different places and what happens when it grows there in these multiple locations. So we recruited particularly for the US West, and you can see our 20 locations where we have participants growing Sandpoint. We were really excited by the response we got to this project as well. We had many more applicants than we were able to accept. And so that's really promising for us as we think about growing this work over time, which as with Silphium needs to happen with Sandpoint. And recently we started to get pictures of plants in the ground. So this is one of the civic science plots that is out at Cal Poly Student Experimental Farm. And so you can see the seedlings out there and what Sandpoint looks like in that lower left picture. Similarly, we need to scale up Sandpoint, and there again are existing and emerging methodologies and approaches to do this, to rigorously assess different varieties using large networks of people and participants and to analyze that data. So again, we think that by beginning an experimental pilot project, we can learn how to facilitate it, we can better understand our needs, and we can make wise decisions about how to scale up and utilize that network to advance this perennial crop in process. And then the last project that I'll mention is another very recent one that is just launched, and this is a citizen science project in which Kernza flour and grain, the flour and grain produced by intermediate wheatgrass, Thanopyrum intermedium, our domestication project that results in the first perennial grain on the market, is now on the market for people to buy and use and bake and cook with. So through this project with a partnership with a company called Perennial Pantry, we have this flour and grain available for purchase, and when people receive it, they will be able to use some of the recipes that will provide and share with us their results. What the taste was like, what the experience was like, what they were interested in, what motivated them to participate, how they might want to continue to learn and participate with us over time. So this project, we're excited to see what that survey data might look like and how people's relationships with Kernza are growing or could grow. And we understand this a little bit more as a citizen science project because it is just a sort of one-time survey that people fill out and share data. But we hope that we'll get responses that motivate and that encourage and support us in growing a larger community of people who are involved in ongoing research and relationship with Kernza, just like the larger Kernza community has ongoing relationships and growing relationships with a network of producers and supply chain participants and consumers. So if you're interested in this project, this screenshot is from a recent blog post on kernza.org where you can learn more about it. Finally, I wanted to say that this methodology of civic science and these projects has implications and opportunities for the Land Institute's work with global partners. We have partners already doing civic science work in terms of involving community members, local knowledge, different ways of knowing and cultural relationships with plants into their projects, including their perennial domestication projects. And so this offers us an opportunity to learn how to better advance those methods and to share them with more people and to grow this work. We need to understand how civic science can help us and our partners and collaborators in the growing global perennial agriculture network overcome barriers to participation, involve local and cultural knowledge, and bring more people into this work in order to advance the work of making agriculture perennial. So I'll end there and start opening it up for questions, and just want to say thanks again for listening and participating and being here with us.
Thank you, Aubrey. Yeah, as Aubrey said, we'll now open it up for questions. To reiterate, please utilize the chat function if you have any questions that pop up during this period, and we will facilitate the Q&A with the scientists. We had a few come in with registration, so we'll start there. So somebody was wondering what the communications channels are for growers, and say if they noticed a pest on their plant, how would they get it identified, and then how would that information then be used by the Land Institute?
Yeah, I can answer that, and then I'll have other people chime in. So right now, with our existing civic science pilot groups, we have we send monthly emails. We have a dedicated email address and people who check and answer emails every day. And then we also have Facebook communities, private groups for people where they can post questions and share knowledge with each other. So for one of our civic science participants who notices something interesting or concerning, they would probably email or call us directly through our main sort of portal of entry for the project and share with us. We also anticipate some of these questions coming up, and so we prepare different materials to help support people. And maybe Ebony or Catherine can talk a little bit about some of the plans that we have for developing that support and those educational materials for our participants during the summer.
Sorry, one of the things that we're putting together is a little booklet, at least of some of the pests and pathogens that we've noticed so far of Silphium in Kansas. Of course, it's not going to be the same everywhere though. So certainly we're encouraging people, if they see unusual insects or the leaves look funny somehow, that they should be sending in pictures and letting us know. It's our hope that eventually we might also be able to travel to some of these sites and engage a little further with the civic scientists in collecting data at sites that look particularly interesting.
And I think we're also hopeful that we'll be able to receive samples at some point. And so people could collect leaves or collect maybe even insects and mail those to us if they're not identifiable just from a picture.
Great. In a similar vein, to date, have these civic science projects answered any major research questions or spawned any new research directions? I don't know if David or Brandon, if through your research programs, these have kind of opened up new areas of interest for you, or cracked any long-standing questions.
Well, they've certainly opened up areas of interest in expanding our breeding work into multiple regions and using different approaches. We've only been doing it for a single season, and so Silphium doesn't even flower the first year, so it's really a little too early to be able to get a lot of data or other kinds of insights.
Yeah, and the Sandpoint Civic Science Project is even newer. We've just sent the plants out a few weeks ago, so or some of the participants may have not even received their plants yet. So there's a lot that we're very excited about. One of the key things for a plant breeder or a plant breeding program is to understand what we call our target populations of environments. So the specific regions that have some sort of similar characteristics. So what regions of the US could we plant Sandpoint or Silphium and know that in general genotypes or varieties all function the same within those regions? We don't really know that for our crops at this point, and so this sort of study really helps us answer those questions. And by sending different varieties or different genotypes to all those different regions, we can also start understanding how some varieties might perform better in certain regions than others. And so that's really key for us as we design breeding programs and think into the future about how we want to select the crops we're working on and develop varieties that are adapted to each of those specific locations.
Right, and kind of also in that vein, somebody was wondering if the results of the project have been as diverse as the growing locations are. And I guess if we're early on in both locations, we could also kind of taper that question to, is it the hope that growing results would be diverse across those locations, or were you looking for more uniform type of responses?
One of my hopes is to use these crops as kind of bait, because we're trying to figure out what's out there that will hurt them. And since we haven't grown them in a lot of places, we don't always know. We're starting to figure out what can come along here, but they don't always come along every year, or we keep getting new things. So we know there's other enemies out there and other hazards. And so in that sense, I do kind of expect to see things that we've never seen before when we try to grow them in places we've never grown them before.
And building off of David's bait analogy, I think we're also using this project as bait for people. Yesterday I had a conversation with someone from the American Pulse Association, so kind of a nonprofit overseeing organization that funds research and identifies key questions that are necessary for the expansion and development of the pulse industry in the US. And they hadn't heard of Sandpoint before. I have repeated conversations with people trying to spell the word Sandpoint for them and teach them a little bit about it. And I think this is a key way for the Land Institute and for us in general to spread knowledge of our crops around the US. So.
And I would maybe add that one result that we have just from the initial launch of the projects is evidence that people do want to participate and are interested in learning about this. We honestly did not know when we started whether people would respond to invitations or opportunities, and we still need to learn more about how to make projects like this more accessible to more people who may not have access to land or who may need support in being able to participate materially. But I think that just knowing that people are really excited and people want to be able to say Sandpoint and spell Silphium, and those are great things to have that. And maybe I would also add, the eventual goal with the creation of food crops is that they would be broadly adapted. So of course we want to see diverse growing results, and we need diverse participation in order to geographically and culturally in order to get those robust results and to be able to understand them. But we do hope that we're creating crops that could be widely grown and used and can really make an ecological impact at a landscape scale.
Great. Another question, do we hold more value in the qualitative feedback we receive or the quantitative feedback? Or is there one or the other that is more helpful for the research programs? I'll let the lead scientists fight over how that can relate to one of their programs.
I think this platform allows us to ask a lot of different kinds of questions. So we're asking questions that could be helpful for genetics, but also for natural history and ecology, and also education and motivation, like Aubrey was talking about. So it's not really, I don't think we have to choose.
Okay, great.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say that, one of the things that feels really exciting to me is that we have the opportunity and we can figure out how to create a platform that helps us even more understand multiple types of data. So it matters a lot, the story that people tell and the words they use, I'll say as a literary critic, and their firsthand experiences, but people's behavior and choices and the facts on the ground matter a lot too. And so this means that we can put those pieces together and connect them rather than feeling like we don't have the ability or capacity to gather that data. So one of the things that is difficult about this, the pilot project stage, is just that this takes a lot of work up front to design and collect and facilitate. And the more data you gather, the more I think elegant you need to be about the methods you're using to analyze and learn from it in order to make it useful. So there's a lot of promise here, but there's also a lot of opportunity for us to innovate and be smart and thoughtful, and maybe learn and see things we didn't know or predict that we would see, which feels like actually authentic research where you're learning something that you didn't know before.
Definitely. Another question, do any of the civic scientists currently grow both Silphium and Sandpoint? Are any of the growers experimenting with growing both of those?
I think that some of the Sandpoint civic science participants who just joined will also be some of them were excited about also growing Silphium, and they may be in the group that grows some of the ecotype isolation plots. So yes, there is that possibility. We are getting more interest in people who would like to have more land and have more space beyond a handful of plants, and we hope that we're going to be able to grow with them in some cases too.
Great. It looks like the last question are there currently any international growers, or would there be an opportunity in the future for an international participant?
Right now, we aren't shipping plants or seedlings internationally for civic science projects. We've had interest and applicants in both Mexico and Canada for the projects, and logistically it just wasn't the right moment to overcome some of those things. But I think that what we might be most interested in is supporting other civic science projects that could be led by some of our international collaborators. So the slide I showed at the end with some of one international group, the Makania Research Collective, they work with different teachers in their area. They have a civic science project with oak seedlings there. They also are working with other growers in places to collect wild plants and things like that. So we might be better served by helping international collaborators start projects like this in their places and with the crops they're working on, which might be similar to ours. We have a lot of international collaborators with Silphium, for instance, that maybe David could talk more about.
Yeah, we are involved with kind of farmer-initiated small-scale experiments or observations in Argentina, and there are collaborators working on a different species of Silphium in Germany and Austria. But an exciting thing is if we are able to get a kind of database and platform built, that should also greatly increase the simplicity of doing multi-region and multi-country kinds of studies, and also help make it easier for people in other countries to do their own work, and then link that with our work or with each other.
Perfect. Well, thank you. It looks like that's all the questions that came in. If any questions do come in after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself. You should all have my email just from the Zoom registration. So please don't hesitate to reach out and I can put you in touch with the appropriate person. But other than that, thank you to our panelists once again for coming here to talk today. Hope you all learned something new about the civic science programming going on here. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website or our social media channels to stay up to date on the latest opportunities to engage with us. But other than that, one more big thanks to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your week. Take care.